All right. Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started now. I am Gabriel Metcalf, the CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and you are joining us for today's edition of CFS Live with Dr. Cathy Foley, the Chief Scientist for CSIRO. Our topic today is Knowledge is the Future, CSIRO's Science and Technology Spurring Recovery and Resilience After COVID-19. To begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. While we're meeting online and you may be in a different part of Sydney or Australia or the world, I am on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. To set the stage for today's talk, let's just reflect for a moment on what's happening with the Australian economy. Australia has navigated this pandemic far better than virtually any other country in the world so far. It's quite extraordinary. I thank my lucky stars every day that I get to be here and not America for it. And yet, the risks of a resurgence are still quite present. And Australia is still facing the largest recession in decades, perhaps since the 1930s. This recession comes on top of previous existing vulnerabilities for Australia: declining labor productivity, stagnant wages, a less complex industrial structure than other rich countries, and looming ahead, the uncomfortable truth that eventually some of the exports, like the coal, are going to decline. So Australia enters the recession with those pre-existing challenges. The truth about recessions is that they change the structures of economies. This has been a theme we have been sounding across a whole series of events and papers. Recessions are not something you just get back to the way you were afterwards. Some firms don't come back, some industries don't come back to their former strength, which means that the way to get back to growth is to welcome new industries and new firms. Which brings us to today's topic. This event is part of a series of events where we are exploring what the future of Australia's economy and society might look like. Dr. Cathy Foley, as Chief Scientist of CSIRO, has a unique vantage point on that. CSIRO, as you all will know, is Australia's national science agency and innovation catalyst. Dr. Foley has personally made contributions in understanding superconducting materials and the development of devices using superconductors to detect magnetic fields and locate deposits of minerals. Her resume is filled with all kinds of awards and honors, which I will not read through. But her position as chief scientist gives her a unique overview of all kinds of scientific fields and what some of the possibilities are for Australia's future scientific and economic strength. So the way this works, those of you who have been on these will know, Dr. Foley will make remarks. You can submit questions via the Q&A app on Zoom, and then I will do my best to sort through those, and we'll have a discussion. With that, Dr. Foley, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I'll just share my screen and get going. So, here we go. So I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that we're meeting on today all across Sydney. I'm actually in North St Ives, or in St Ives Chase, which is the land of the Guramaradal people. And I want to thank them for giving us permission to leave our footprints alongside theirs, as we, I guess, particularly now are looking at what a sustainable future looks like. So today, I'd like to use this as an opportunity to talk about the role of science in charting our nation's future, particularly as we look to rebuild post-COVID. So in many ways, CSIRO has been around for over 100 years, and it's seen its way in showing how science and technology can really help the nation be able to solve some of its big problems and navigate a way out, and make sure that we're also prepared for the unexpected. And I think that we're getting to a point in time now where we're poised to make some really big decisions about what our future is like, and these decisions will have an enormous impact on our future. So as a nation, we could actually go one way or the other, depending on our actions. And I hope that science will help us guide the way. And I think and many of you may remember a movie or a series of movies which I quite liked, which was Back to the Future. And that actually really showed in a really fun way about how decisions can happen that can decide on whether we have a particular point in time where we make decisions one way or the other, and as a consequence can have a very different world. And Australia's got those issues in bucket loads. We've got drought, we've got management of our water systems, such as the Murray-Darling Basin. The Great Barrier Reef is under threat. We, as Gabrielle mentioned, have huge reliance on coal as our energy source. We have an industry mix that may not necessarily serve us in the way we need to in the future to be a globally competitive country. And at a glance, although we have a very long life expectancy in Australia, one of the highest in the world, 11 years of our long lives are in ill health, and nearly half the population have chronic disease, much of it as a consequence of lifestyle choices. So with all that in mind, and also using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we worked with the Australian, National Australia Bank to develop what we called was Australian National Outlook. And it was a bit of a bold undertaking where we wanted to see how we could use science to map out the future of Australia. And this is, I think, possibly the first time science has been used to predict a pathway to prosperity for the whole nation. And the idea is to use innovation to drive that prosperity and to keep us globally competitive. And from that, we could either have a slow decline outcome, which is one option, depending on what we choose to do. Or if we went through and took different decisions, we could actually have a much more positive outlook. And it told us that despite having 3 decades of economic growth, and our economy has until recently been going really well, although a bit in the slow lane, and that growth and wages have been flatlining, it told us that we needed to reinvent our industries to make them more unique, more profitable. And if we didn't do that, we'd be at the risk of being in a bad place economically. So basically, we didn't realise when we did this that just around the corner was a pandemic, and that was going to lead us to being in a recession. We also, I have to realise that COVID-19 has provided an accelerator of disruption, which maybe has been the kick that we needed as a nation, so that we can rethink our economy and the mix of industries we've had because of this disruption. And it's given us a chance to think about our economy and the complexity of our export. Our options, offerings, we are able to think about industries that are very different to what we have today. So if you think, globally, Australia is a relatively small population. We're only a small percentage of the world's population, and yet economically we're in the top 20. We're 13th at the moment. But if you look at some of the measures and indicators, the predictions are modelling that some work done by PwC is that our purchasing power is going to go down from 19th to 28th by 2050. That if you look at some recent work done by Harvard University looking at our global economic complexity index, it's very low. So we're down below Uganda. And the reason for that is that we tend to sell our resources, whether it's agricultural or mineral resources, without actually adding much value. And why is that? It's because we have chosen and I guess moved into an understanding and a way of dealing with our domestic market where we don't tend to have radical new products. We tend to be much more incremental, and even our adaptation is not as high as it could be. So CSIRO, our role is quite different from other research organisations in the country, where our role is to actually look at these issues and solve these greatest challenges with a view of using science and technology. But we also realise it's not those alone, it's actually the whole wraparound of the social science, the economy, economics, the business development, and also just the business models that are needed to make things happen are all relevant. And we also have to have an eye onto the future. And there was this great cartoon which was in the Australian Financial Review a month or so ago, which I think pictures CSIRO really well, where we're sort of protecting the nation in many ways, but also being prepared for anything. So putting that all together, we've identified where we think our Australia's greatest challenges are. And these have been, and I'm just going to summarise these very, very briefly. So the first one is that we need to have sustainable energy and resources, and that's been a very big struggle for the country, trying to transition into something that is fit for purpose when we have the luxury of having so many wonderful coal resources, which have served us well over the existence of modern Australia. We also want to have a secure Australia and region, not just protecting us militarily, although it looks like that's becoming something of a greater priority, but also protect us from cyber viruses and also real ones, which we've just seen with biosecurity and the global pandemic we're experiencing now. We also need to make sure that we have the future industries that create the new products and deliver high margins and support high wages rather than just commodities. We need to make sure that we have a valuable and resilient environment and get to a point where it's industry and environment actually working in partnership rather than in competition. We also are recognising that food security is absolutely a basic requirement. We're going to be needing to feed 3 billion more people with half as much water. So how can we make sure we're positioned for that? And then finally, we are experiencing now need for us to have a way of managing our health and well-being so that we don't have 11 million Australians suffering chronic disease, and that we can afford to cure them, and that hopefully we can prevent them from being sick in the first place. So if we are going to deliver on all these challenges though, the thing that's really interesting is that new industries, new businesses, new products are all required to deliver on that. And so in many ways, they're all interconnected, but the future industries is really the pathway and the platform to make this work. So national preparedness is part of what we've been thinking about, and it's not something new for CSIRO because that's really the reason why we have existed. And I'm just going to look at the role of preparedness because it's been in the forefront for us in Sydney and in New South Wales in particular, starting off with over the last summer, the dreadful bushfires we had, where we all experienced not just the smoke if you weren't in the bushfire areas, but in our regions where whole communities were devastated. And you may have seen that CSIRO scientists were involved in the current Royal Commission and has supported the New South Wales Government's Mary O'Kane a review of the bushfires and being able to provide detailed submissions about how we can prepare and prevent another severe bushfire event. So I'm just going to quickly look at some examples of things that are there for the taking. So satellite detection and monitoring is something which we have been working on previously. CSIRO actually bought 10% of the Novasat-1 satellite, which we manage on behalf of the nation. And with that, we're able to collect and analyse data at the scale and impact of the recent bushfires, and being able to develop new methodologies to monitor for future bushfires, and that's still work in progress. And this is really critical, especially in smoky and cloudy conditions, and being able to do that in real time. Another one is actually the impact and assessment and bushfire surveyor mobile apps. So things which are being able to deliver real, useful, tangible products and methods and devices and systems that allow, in this case, the firefighters to be able to collect data, review building controls, being able to understand what's happening in bushfire-prone areas. And then understanding actually the rate of how fires spread and models for them for the Australian vegetational context. So this is something which is based on 60 years plus of research that we've done. And we're in the process of updating the fire spread models that have been around for a while, taking into account climate change and other things where we've seen the environment changing. So that's just an absolutely very small part of the work we've been doing, bushfires. Another area, of course, is in the COVID-19, where we knew that a pandemic was something that we had to be prepared for. And that preparedness allowed us to hit the ground running in the response to the COVID-19. And since 2015, we have been working nationally with all researchers and the medical support to have a One Health model so that we can respond to a disease threat in multiple ways. And that's including vaccine development, medical supply production, to data modeling and environmental science. I'll give you some examples. So the COVID-19, as I mentioned, is unprecedented, but it wasn't unforeseen and we weren't unprepared. Australia has or CSIRO runs the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness. And with that One Health model, we did have those different things I mentioned before, all under development and ready to go. We'd strengthened ties with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, and so that we were in a position to work with nationally and internationally with our domestic network, including the Doherty Institute from the University of Melbourne, University of Queensland and James Cook University, to undertake vaccine development. So vaccine development usually takes about 2 to 5 years to develop, and we're trying to do this in less than 12 months. Currently, or we've just finished testing on in our centre down in Geelong, 2 candidates, one from the US from Inovio and another from Oxford University. We've also been working with Queensland University's candidate to scale that up with advanced biologics in a facility in Clayton. And what we've been doing is developing vaccines at breakneck speed, and I'll show you how that happens. So this is a traditional methodology for developing a vaccine, and you can see a time frame at the bottom there. So you do preclinical testing. We were using ferrets as our model in Geelong, testing antigens and antigens, and then putting them together to be able to go into clinical testing. Phase 1 with looking for the safety, phase 2 looking for efficacy, and then phase 3 with general population, and then the 4th phase is mass vaccination. When we go through looking at what we've done, it's been spectacular. Where in what would have been 13 years roughly, work's been done in 6 months or so, and we're hoping that the next stages will happen quickly as well. And this is the different stages of developing the vaccine. So we've got the virus being detected, and then understanding what the vaccine development looks like or is needed goes through one pathway, and then being able to create the biologics, and that means taking something from a laboratory into something that's at scale that can be tested is not an easy thing to do. And that's now got to a point where the vials are ready and it's being tested for toxicology now, and then going into animal models. So that's happening at the Queensland University. Then there were the 2 which we tested in our laboratories based on the CEPI requests, and we've gone all the way through looking at our animal models, and they've completed that now, and they're going through this fast tracking of development of clinical trials. So this is just a view so you get an idea of the complexity of these laboratories. There's only 6 of these sorts of laboratories in the world, and this is the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is where its containment floor level where you can see people wearing spacesuits to be able to work with the virus and the animal testing. This is the laboratory where they went through and scaled up the vaccines, so that developed by University of Queensland, so that then can be used for testing as well. And again, using a whole range of, in this case, different chemistry techniques. But the other thing we need to know is more about this virus. It's emerging that it's got a range of different structures, and trying to identify which is the most common one to be focusing on, so that we're able to understand how it reacts with the body. We still really don't know all that much about how it makes you sick, why some people get it and impacted very badly and die, while other people don't even have any symptoms. And so going through trying to understand that is something, looking at the genomic signature, and some really basic work has been done with that, also using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Something more basic though is looking at understanding where this virus is in our population, and we're seeing reinfection happening after we thought we'd got it under control. But wastewater is a way to be able to look at this. So the virus survives in feces, or is able to be seen in feces before you actually get any symptoms. And so looking at populations and measuring the feces coming from the sewer is allowing us to understand where it is in the population, and therefore be able to help, first of all, look at areas where there's potential infection even before it's showing up with symptoms. And this is something which all the water services around Australia, like Sydney Water and across the country, are looking at how they can use this to be able to provide health, public health data. The next thing is looking at the PPE equipment, including ventilators and masks. And I love this picture. This is from Brazil, where they have a requirement to wear masks when you're outside. And in some cases, the definition of a mask was not clear of what that mask was for. And we didn't want to get to a point where that we didn't have enough masks to go around. And the government actually showed how agile and responsive our manufacturing sector can be, so that local manufacturers, such as Textile Technologies, who we know make the materials, for example, that are used in Kimberly-Clark nappies, are able to shift their and pivot their production to be able to make materials that can be used for masks. Also in CSIRO at our Geelong labs, in which we share with Deakin University, we've had high scale-up textile manufacturing. We were able to pull together something off the shelf, which is a synthetic microfiber, which is linked in with wool to be able to make a mask material that is actually much better, more effective, and potentially reusable after washing and drying in a drying machine. And then the other is you want to make sure they work. So establishing local testing capability and to go with the commercial production has been critical. Previously, all testing was done in the USA, and in breakneck speed, we've been able to see the testing come up and be established locally, so that, again, showing how quickly and responsive both research organisation and industry can be. The other is also the importance of collecting data and being able to present it in a way that policymakers can see what's happening and have analysis at that. And gathering information and presenting it in a usable fashion has been critical. This is an example of the data that is being used by government departments, including Prime Minister and Cabinet, and also looking at analysis of that. So we're able to look at, in the top here, when it's below that line, it's saying that's when one person infects one other person, being able to go through and understanding what the different impacts are with that data to help make good decisions. And then, of course, finally is in the COVID area, is looking at the tracking device on our mobile phones, making sure that it actually works well. We've been doing that in partnership with the Home Affairs and other government departments, and providing technical advice so that they're able to provide that localization. So the next thing which we need to think about, though, is looking at how we can look ahead and be prepared for the unexpected. And the thing is that these responses don't happen with an overnight pulling a rabbit out of a hat. We need to plant the seeds now that will enable us to meet our future challenges head on once we decide what they are. And that's what we're doing currently. We're going through looking at the impact of climate change, need for better health, more sustainable environment. What are the new industries we need to have? And how can we have cleaner, more affordable energy so that we're, making sure that we are prepared in a way that Australia can be responsive. So previously I spoke about the importance of economic resilience, and the slowing economy is saying that we need to address some of these challenges that I mentioned earlier on. And COVID is just one of them, but it's one that's made us realise we have to accelerate some of these changes. So we need to create new high-value markets that play into our strengths, and we need to make sure that we're creating an economy that secures new jobs and wealth for future generations. But the world is rapidly changing, and competitive industries of tomorrow will be looking vastly different from what they look like today. And we've got some examples which I'm going to go through now. So one of the things we do, first of all, is identify, and this is where CSIRO brings in this wraparound of looking at what we call our CSIRO Futures team that have extensive experience in nationally focusing on industries of growth for us, and what the response and strategies should be for us to be able to make the most of the opportunities. Here's a picture of some of the ones we've done, and we've worked both with government and private clients to be able to work through looking at how we can create a roadmap to make sure that we put the policy settings or support government in putting policy settings in place, and make sure the technology focus areas are the correct ones so that we're developing the right science and technology to deliver. I'm going to go through a few examples. So for advanced manufacturing is top of mind. We've recognised that we've let that slip, and that sovereign capability is going to be something of greater importance. Although there's globalisation happening, there is also digitisation and introduction of robotics that will really make us start to be able to address some of those long-standing disadvantages. So, and also there's a greater demand for more bespoke and complex solutions. So that means that maybe the manufacturing of the past, which wasn't seen as competitive, is potentially going to allow us to have small, dispersed local markets that will allow us to be very effective, make the most of our geographic remoteness just because of the focus in the Asia Pacific area, and overcome some of the high labour costs. The megatrends in transforming manufacturing are the idea of making to measure, so moving from mass production to bespoke solutions. That service expansion, looking at integrated service product bundles. The idea being that instead of buying a white good such as a washing machine, you actually buy 30,000 washers, and that's all digital up so that they know when it's broken down and needs fixing, or when the time comes to replace it, and you actually just buy the service. Smart and connected, so that data analytics are optimizing operations. That's sustainable, so we have more closed loop economy, so that we have a circular economy in operation, and that the supply chain is transformed so that we're creating greater collaboration and technology advances, including and enabling vertical integration. So there are immense strategic growth opportunities for this sector, and that to happen requires us to embrace sensors and data analytics, advanced materials, robotics and automation, additive manufacturing with 3D metal printing or 3D printing, and also the use of augmented and virtual reality. Another area of great opportunity for Australia is in using hydrogen as an important versatile energy carrier and feedstock for us. Australia is really well placed for this and to build a sustainable economic domestic and export market there. And it will also help us to meet agreed emissions targets and address concerns about energy security. If we manage this transition, it will allow us to have a greater portion of renewables in our electricity network while overcoming the challenges associated with intermittency. And it also, I think, will underpin a series of mature technologies. Is underpinned by a series of mature technologies that do exist in Australia. And I think we're at the verge of this tipping point, which will really have a big impact on our energy security and supply. Another new area which the government has identified, the federal government has identified as an opportunity, and that the New South Wales government is focusing on with the Aerotropolis, is space. And the aim here is for us to triple the size of our space industry by to $12 billion by 2030. So it's 10 years away. And the opportunities here are looking at building capabilities in observing the Earth from space, satellite communications and positioning, navigation and timing data. And that will be really important also with managing disasters as well as water management. The need for satellite object tracking, as we've got more stuff in space, being able to manage space debris as well as enable deep space communication will be critical. And then also space exploration is on the agenda, although that might go on the back burner a bit post-COVID, but harnessing industrial and research strengths across astronomy, mining, manufacturing, medicine, agriculture and robotics are all possible. On the agenda is the Moon to Mars capability, which has got the whole potential of a whole range of things, which, although it looks as a bit science fiction in thought, actually has huge spin-offs where that, inspiration and futuristic thinking can inspire us to think of ways of challenging needs for managing, for example, remote Australia. Finally, I just want to look at quantum industries, which are a very new industry. We in May released a roadmap looking at how to bring the great research we're doing in Australia and very much focused in Sydney and turn that into a potential $4 billion opportunity. So it's a big potential global industry by 2040, about $86 billion. And many countries are investing big time into that. But that doesn't mean Australia is not competitive. We believe that there's really great opportunity and we're well placed for this because of the long-term investment. And I won't go into all the details here, but quantum computing is a great opportunity. And we have, for example, the University of New South Wales under Michelle Simmons, former Australian of the Year, quantum computing company, looking at playing the long game there and having a silicon-based quantum computer, which is looking very positive and is showing a new regime of research translating from universities into the broader market. But they also have much broader applications from communication networks, defence, mineral exploration, water resources. And we have many startup companies that are evolving and seeing their translation of quantum technologies from the research lab. And we've had startup companies, for example, that have been identified as one of the top 10, that's Q Control, coming out of Sydney University, one of the top 10 startups in the world. So we're very competitive there. We also need to recognise that underpinning all this future work requires us to have future science platforms. The way in CSIRO that we've organised our research is, and I won't go through these in detail, but in particular areas which will allow us to create the science that is necessary so it can be there to support future industries. But to make this all happen, we need the enabling factors such as commercialisation, collaborations, which is, I won't show up the stat, but shows that Australia is pretty bad when compared to other OECD countries. We need to have the skills there with the workforce, and we need to make sure we make the most of our full human potential, making sure that women are part of this equation, report from a week or so ago from the Gender Equity Insights showed that, for example, an increase of 10% in leadership positions of women leads to a company's market value going up by 6.5%, or an average of $105 million. So there's an economic imperative there. We also need to make sure that our science sector is operating in a smarter way, and we operate in a more ecosystem approach to commercialization, so that every part of the sector knows its place, from where universities are at their best, going from basic to applied, that CSIRO and other publicly funded agencies are there helping to support that translation across, and that we're able to see state governments and industry as the delivery of impact. But to do that, we need to be able to scale up and have that and be able to bridge the valley of death. And that's something which we're focusing on. So being able to have scale up and reduce risk. We've introduced the On Accelerator program, where researchers are able to look at what their inventions are and being able to look at what the market is. And since that's set up, over 53 companies have been begun from that in the last 4 years. CSIRO looks after government, federal government programs of SME Connect, because Australia is a land of SMEs. 97% of our companies are small to medium enterprises, and 70% of them have less than 20 staff. So engaging SMEs with researchers to enable them to have innovation is important. We have our Kickstart programs and a range of Industry Plus and a number of other ones there that have been very successful. And then there's also the Venture Capital Main Sequence Ventures, which also not only does investment, but also works with potential companies, whether they fund them or not, in their office hours to help them navigate setting up a business. So just to finish, success of any technology and opportunity does need to have a technology needed based on deep science and understanding. But it needs to have a business model that works, and we've seen that with the introduction of many social media-based industries where they've really turned the business model on its head. We need to make sure that to adopt that technology is seamless and easy to adopt, because people don't want to use things that are hard to use. And we also recognise the importance of government regulation, so that we're prepared and ready to be able to see the adoption of new industries in a way that is sustainable, responsible, and able to achieve what we plan them to achieve. So as I mentioned, forgive me for going back to the future, but we are at this critical juncture of time here. And we have the choice of having, that country which is not very exciting to one which is probably more pleasant land if we are open to it. The Australian National Outlook too has shown a pathway to achieve that. And I think that we've got to a point now where we've got the COVID-19 has given us a point in time to pause and rethink our economy. We've identified the 6 great challenges that we need to address, and we'll be soon talking about how we're approaching those with the detailed missions being developed to deliver on those. We recognise that partnership and collaboration across government, research and industry is absolutely necessary to make these big ideas a reality. I have to commend the New South Wales government, who've been a fabulous supporter of seeing with their plans and their bold ambition to make this happen. And we want to make sure that this comes together so that the flow-on benefits the lives and lifestyles and the wealth of Sydney-siders. So with that, I'll stop and say thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Foley. That is an incredible overview, and is going to, I think, support a pretty wide-ranging conversation. Everybody feel free to submit questions via the Q&A app. Let's start with a kind of foundational question. The idea of innovation. It's actually been somewhat politicized in Australia. And some people, when they hear this kind of talk, think that means the robots are coming for my job. What do you say to address people's fears about a future of work that does not include them?
That's a very important question. And it's something where we know that it's had political impacts where innovation has been identified as I will lose my job. And I think there's a couple of components here. One is education is really critical. And I'll give you an example of something in Sydney. If you type into Google what is it? Programming classes for kids near me, and you'll see that on the eastern seaboard there's huge number of so on the coast here there's a huge number of dots everywhere of classes for kids to learn about programming. As soon as you go a little bit west, you see almost none. So that we're not necessarily enriching our young people with the opportunities to see where this all fits together. And we've got to be careful that we don't end up with an east and west, particularly in places like Sydney, divide, where we see people thinking very traditionally in where the jobs are. And I think that's one thing. The second is I expect that we do need to be better at showing how actually the creation of automation often creates new jobs but in different ones, so that it does. And we just go back to looking at the areas where we employed lots of people. Mining these days actually doesn't employ that many people. It's actually much more automated. Agriculture actually is much more automated. But there's still other jobs behind the scenes which are needed to be able to deliver those things, which are higher paid, do require more education and skills. And that's what we have to make sure we do, is go through and have that plan for the workforce of the future, and make sure that we encourage our young people to recognise how to make good decisions, so that they're getting the training and the development and education at the right time, before knowing that there's a lot of, there must be risk there, because people are used to saying, there's a job I want, not there's a job I want, but it's not invented yet. And that's something I think we haven't managed well yet. And there's great opportunity to improve on that.
That Atlas of Economic Complexity, when it came out, got a lot of people's attention, showing Australia having, showing Australia being ranked with countries that it does not admire. And so the solution, as you suggest, is to add more value to the things before exporting them. What is CSIRO's strategy for how to make that happen? Will you be starting companies? Will you be investing in companies? Or do you just hope to persuade entrepreneurs to do that?
That's a good question. So we actually operate in a range of different business models. So in some cases, we start companies. A really good example is V2 Foods. So you might have seen just recently, I guess it was the end of last year, a startup company called V2 Foods that came out of CSIRO, funded by Main Sequence Ventures. This came about from some researchers who developed a plant protein that could be a meat replacement. And what they did was the researchers found that that was very competitive. That was something where you can't tell the difference. And they went through the ON program, found that there was definitely a market there, but they weren't the ones to necessarily spin out the company. But by working with Main Sequence Ventures, they found the CEO who started up the company. CSIRO's part supporter of this as well. And now it's got to a point where it's got a supply chain into Hungry Jack's. Mr. Hungry Jack's didn't even know the difference between he couldn't tell the difference between his meat one and his vegetable one. We were able to use a scale-up facilities at Werribee, where we've got a food scale-up. They've got funding now with their investments set up in Albury Wodonga, a factory. And that's one model. So then we've got ones where we work with business, where we do existing businesses to help them grow. And sometimes we invest with them. So for example, Medical Devices International is the company that makes the green whistle, that emergency pain relief. You might see it on Bondi Lifesaver and quite often when people hurt themselves in football games. And they had the Australian market. They're about a $3 or $4 million company. They wanted to go to a global market. They couldn't scale. They came to us. They had no money to scale. We actually invested $750,000 into working out a technique to be able to make that scalable using a new process. It worked, and then we worked with them and helped invest that company. And now it's worth $300 and something million delivering pain relief to the world. So, you know, I could go on with many other examples, but the thing is that it depends. As I mentioned before, the business model has to meet the requirements of the market and what makes sense. And the thing is that CSIRO is very flexible. It will sometimes start up a company. It will sometimes work with an existing company, but it will do the investment that's needed if that's what's required.
Okay, quite a few questions about COVID, that part of your presentation,
Sure.
as you might expect. You showed a great slide of the compressed timeline to develop a vaccine, but several people are asking, in your personal judgment, what is the most likely timeline before a vaccine is in mass distribution?
Okay. Look, we've got the optimistic one, which is so far things are looking very positive. And as you can imagine, I have to be very careful. I don't actually know the outcomes of some of these animal trials, but only saying they're very promising. And the reason being that there's a lot of money to be made and there's businesses involved, so we have to be mindful of that. But the next stage is clinical trial 1 and 2 are already underway for, I think the Oxford one they started doing clinical trial 1 as soon as they saw it was safe. And so they're well on their way. And then the American one, I think, is also in its trials as well. So the next thing is how can you scale up? And there's something like 100 vaccines being developed at the moment. So, and different candidates. So my expectation will be that there will be a vaccine of some sort, which may not be perfect, but will help mitigate. It may go back to when we were all young and polio was rife, and there was the introduction, first of all, of a vaccine that sort of worked a little bit, but then sometime later they introduced the Sabine vaccine, which absolutely knocked it on its head. But they had a 2-stage thing. So the first one was enough to get by and mitigate, but then the absolute vaccine happened later on. So I expect you'll probably see something like that happen. But scaling up and delivery of that, there'll probably be a number of different vaccines that are developed that will have a level of effectiveness, because there's different ways you can skin a cat in delivering a vaccine to create the immune response. And you'll probably see what will happen is eventually one will be seen as being better than the other, and it will become the dominant one in time. The biggest issue will be manufacturing. Some of them are easier to manufacture because they're a bit like the way we make flu vaccines, and others are using a whole new technology which will require a new approach for scale up. And so that will be the biggest hurdle is availability, and of course richer nations will get it first. And then I guess the thing is working out agreements, and I know there are agreements with CEPI as to, because it's a non-for-profit, and it's looking at how you make sure that these are made available to countries that aren't high GDP nations, and how we can make sure we can deliver it to them in an equitable way. And that's going to probably take a longer period of time. So I suspect we will find that, you know, this time next year there will be a level of immunisation available, but it may not necessarily be the killer one.
Do you expect, in terms of the supply chain, that Australia will be manufacturing the vaccine, or will be importing it?
Yeah, so probably a mixture. We are well placed with CSL, which is one of our most successful companies in the country. And they're in the process of looking into how they can approach manufacture and working out what's possible, but remembering that they've got a certain skill set for and process line for one approach. If it's another approach that's needed, then chances are it may have to be brought in from overseas. But that's being looked at. The federal government's doing a pretty good job at working out a level of preparedness, knowing that there's a bit of a a time frame between now and setting up manufacturing. And so that will hopefully give a chance for the creation of capability locally.
We got a question about a different aspect of COVID, which is testing. If there were a very quick, very accurate test, international travel could resume. You could take a test before getting on the airplane and another one when you land, and problem solved. What do you think are the prospects for a much improved testing regime?
Sure. No, so that's a good question, and there's been a lot of controversy about the testing. So testing is all about statistics, because you don't, false positives, false negatives, that sort of thing. And so when there's a lot of the virus around, 1%, 99% success means that, or it means that you and got large numbers, then you can sort of live within that error bar. But when you've got almost no COVID around, suddenly the false positives and negatives are an issue. So, so getting to a point of having certainty when there's low volume of virus around is the tricky bit, to get a medical device that can work within the tight bounds. And there are a number of techniques being developed, and being able to make sure that you're able to get certainty and reliability is where we're at the moment. Anyone who's been involved with manufacturing devices knows that it's notoriously longer than anything you would expect. As someone who's made devices and systems, it's that last 10% or 5% of development is the bit that seems to go on forever, because you've got to just take it through its paces to make sure that you've got the stats there. But there are a number of very exciting methods being developed in Australia and overseas. People are saying it's going to be ready in a short space of time. Experience has told me that it usually takes 3 times longer than you plan. So if you say people have got saying that 3 months, so let's say 9 months then. So.
Okay, well, that's the voice of experience. A question about cities and innovation. The view has been for a long time that bringing people together face to face is good for innovation. That has led to the way offices are designed. It's led to Silicon Valley modeling its spatial form on universities. It's also led to a kind of renewed belief in the benefits of urbanism, of high density cities as a support for innovation. With COVID, there is now an argument that perhaps a more distributed workforce is going to be the norm in the future as the culture has changed about working from home. How does CSIRO think about proximity? Is it important or not important to bring people together for innovation?
So that is a challenge at the moment, and I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. I think during the COVID period, it's been extraordinary to see how quickly our ability to use platforms such as the one you're using today to create and bring together communities. So we've seen, for example, webinars, which, say for the Australian Institute of Physics, which I'm sure you're all very excited to know exists in Australia, has branches around Australia, and they have meetings. You might get 30 or 50 people as a good event. We had something held as a webinar of an annual event. It was about quantum industries. We had 800 people register and 600 people view on the night, and then people watching the webinar afterwards and asking questions much like this. So the reach to audiences is huge in ways which was completely unexpected. And I think the level of, the thing which I find interesting is when you're on a webinar, I was on one with last week with the Australian Israeli Chamber of Commerce, and they had the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, speaking, and he just gave an informal presentation introduced by John Howard. And it had all these vice chancellors and heads of industry all there in, just looking like you and me in their homes with their, sort of with their t-shirts and it's sloppy joes on. And the thing which I found interesting is its use of social media seems to be a real leveler, so that it seems to allow much more, I guess, equality amongst people and recognition of a broader voice. And also place doesn't matter. So we had, you know, people from overseas, people from different parts of the country calling into meetings, which normally you would think of traveling, and so therefore it reduces who can be involved. So from that perspective, we're hearing more voices and sharing things in ways I think we've never done before, in a way where it's different to sort of social media in a way, because it's real time, and I think, and we've got more authenticity, and I think a challenge in put out information and people can say, I don't know if that's correct or not. But then we've seen that work for 4 months since the COVID has hit in Australia. But I'm beginning to see a few cracks where beginning to happen where our cachet is running out. And I'm just wondering whether we're going to get to a point where we do need to have something hybrid. I think it'd be a shame to lose that ability to bring people together. But I think there is still, you know, that human interaction, those unintended meetings with people, you know, the water cooler discussions, the corridor discussions. I think we need to still recognise that they are going to be still part of, you know, creating connections, relationships, and humans are social creatures, and I think we're going to have to come to some sort of arrangement. So in CSIRO, what we're doing at the moment is recognising that our future work is going to be quite different, that we're really thinking about our labs of the future. What do they need to be? Probably there's more automation, more IT, more design and planning before you get into the lab, more agility in the way our labs are set up, and also where you work from home more when it suits you, but you go into the lab and have that community thing in a different way. So I suspect we're going to see quite a change in the next, well, into the future, and the way we design and think about ourselves. I think universities are struggling with this at the moment. They've built some magnificent campuses. They've got a wonderful economic input to the nation with international student education, as well as educating our own people. And then suddenly overnight going digitally, they're asking the question, well, how much of the campus do we really need? And do we need to refashion our universities in a different way? And that's the big question mark at the moment for them. And I imagine Office Blocks and other things are going to be asking the same question.
All right, Dr. Foley, we are at the end of the hour. It has gone very quickly. I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to share your thoughts with us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank all of you who tuned in for joining us today. We will look forward to seeing you on the next edition of Committee for Sydney Live.